Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 58, recording on Thursday, February 13th. Appreciate you guys being here, recording again from the Alabama studios, and have a little bit of mock draft conversation for you today. So over at theathletic.com, where I do my day job covering the Vikings, I did a full mock draft, made a trade, picked a couple offensive linemen, and we're going to hop right into that from the get-go. I'm going to explain my selections, the thought process behind them, some stuff I've heard, the way I thought about the exercise in general, because I think it provides a great roadmap to how we're going to, watch how this offseason plays out from the combine in a couple weeks, where I will be in Indianapolis talking to executives and coaches and all of that good stuff, to then free agency and the draft to come after that. So I think it's going to be a fun exercise that we will go through. I'll go, like I said, each pick, the thought process behind it, and we will jump into it full stop. As always, this show is presented by First Resource Bank. That is a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area. Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson are the guys running that thing. They do a great job. They're Vikings fans. They keep up with the podcast. I've got to know them in my time in Minnesota, and I've really enjoyed doing that. So they sponsor the podcast. They've got branches everywhere, not in Alabama, but they have great online banking. So while I can't go to the branch, I've got my my app, and the website can finagle things exactly how I want to from down here, but always appreciate their endorsement of the podcast. Like I said, I've got the mock draft over at The Athletic. I've got some other stories written earlier this week, some stuff to come next week, and then we will be full go reporting at the Combine in Indianapolis, like I said, and can't wait to be there. Can't wait to catch up with people. Going to do podcasts from there, so that'll be very, very fun. All right, the mock draft. I made 6 picks, and I made a trade that generated 2 picks, and I picked a bunch of players in the trenches. But I'm going to lay out, before I talk about each pick individually, I think it's important and very illuminative to go through the process that got me to the picks that I ended up selecting. So I think, like, the way you think about a mock draft, it really is an entire team building exercise, because the first question I had to ask before I made selections for this mock draft is, how does free agency go? Because that is first. Free agency will begin around March 10th. It happens fast. Players sign very quickly. You almost wonder if conversations between agents and teams were had at the combine that they happen so quickly, but this stuff happens fast. And how free agency plays out will dictate the positions that the Vikings value and prioritize probably come the draft. And so just to lay it out in terms of how I thought about it. So the Vikings right now have $58 million in salary cap space. Now that number is likely to probably increase from extensions that move back money, from restructuring where money is converted to a signing bonus to free up more space. So I mean, they're going to have a lot of money to spend. I think right now, and I will look this up as I'm talking, but that $58 million in cap space ranks in the top 10 across the NFL in terms of available team spending. I'm going to get you the exact figure for where that ranks. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th most in the NFL in terms of cap spending for 2025. And again, that is without potential moves that are made until the point at which free agency happens. So it's going to be a lot of money to spend. And you guys know, if you listen to the podcast, like, the obvious question to ask is, where will that money be allocated towards mostly? Will it be dispersed all around? I mean, for example, if the Vikings in free agency choose to pay 2 guards, let's just say, and whether it's Will Fries from Indianapolis, whether it's Mekhi Becton from the Eagles, whether it's James Daniels from the Steelers, Tevin Jenkins from the Bears, Patrick McCarry from the Ravens, Aaron Banks from the 49ers, there are a lot of questions there are a lot of options in terms of guards that the Vikings could pay in free agency. Now, you guys might be listening to this and being like, Alec, why didn't you mention Trey Smith of the Chiefs? Well, 2 reasons. One, I think the question is worth asking. Are we sure that the Chiefs aren't going to either extend Trey Smith, considering the holes we saw on their front, Or, I mean, they always could apply the franchise tag to him. Now, that would be a very expensive number, probably close to 25 million, which is a lot for a guard. But if they wanted short-term help, they could all that is at their disposal. And they could even apply the transition tag, which is a tag that I explained last week, I believe. You can apply it, then the player can talk to other teams, and then the Chiefs will get an opportunity to match. So there's a lot of ways the Chiefs could go that ultimately could mean that Trey Smith, who has been belle of the ball, I think, in all conversations around here and a lot of places, in Chicago even, about upgrading the interior of the offensive line. Will Trey Smith even be available? I mean, that's the first question. Then the second question to ask would be, would the Vikings be willing to pay top of the market money for that type of player? Now, you and I could very easily argue that it is time to pay top of the market money for that position in terms of what it would provide you in terms of the pass game and the run game. But those are two questions. He's definitely an option for sure. And then, I mean, you even wade into if they don't pay a guard, maybe they pay one guard. Could they end up choosing to upgrade at center? Could they move from Garrett Bradbury and pay a Drew Dahlman from the Falcons, a Josh Myers from the Packers? I mean, these are relevant questions, but the reason I bring it up is because if that's the route the Vikings go, and they allocate a chunk of their free agent cap space money to the interior of the offensive line, then the likelihood that the Vikings take an interior offensive lineman in the first round in the NFL draft doesn't make a ton of sense. That just wouldn't be the case. Now, if you flip it and it's like, okay, the Vikings, let's say they pay a premium for a defensive tackle in free agency, be it Milton Williams from the Philadelphia Eagles, who we talked about extensively on Tuesday's show, or whether it's Osa Odigizua from the Cowboys. And if I pronounced that correct, that would be phenomenal on my end, and I would be very proud of myself. But he's a defensive tackle from the Cowboys. I believe he had 60 pressures this past season. He's still fairly young. Now, he's not the biggest player in the interior, and he is probably not even the interior run defender that a Milton Williams is. But let's say the Vikings pay a defensive tackle that can rush the passer, and they're paying a premium there, but they only sign, let's say, one guard in free agency. Then you are looking at probably drafting an interior offensive lineman, a guard, high in the first round. Now, the thing I would say, and that most people, I think if you guys listen to this, are in tune to this draft, there are going to be much more interior defensive linemen available at the top of the draft that are intriguing than interior offensive linemen. So just from Kwesi Adofo-Mensah in this front office, they always talk about options and opportunity and keeping as many of those available so you can make the optimal decisions at the right cost and you're not hamstringing yourself to pay more than you actually should. So being that there are more defensive tackles in the draft at the top, it probably makes sense to allocate the majority of the free agent money to interior offensive linemen. The other aspect of that is, I mean, the interior offensive linemen, as Kevin O'Connell has said, as people internally have banged the drum for, I mean, that has to be fixed first and foremost. And so doing that with players who are experienced and who have done it makes a lot of sense to me. The other aspects I think that are worth considering before you even get into the mock draft are what happens at running back. Do the Vikings extend, re-sign Aaron Jones, whose contract is set to void kind of in a few days? If they don't re-sign an Aaron Jones or extend an Aaron Jones, do they end up signing in free agency a Javonte Williams, a younger back from the Broncos? Do they end up signing a Najee Harris type player? If they don't sign any veteran running back in free agency, then it becomes pretty clear that the draft, they're going to have to really hit the running back position. I'd be pretty surprised if that's the route that they go. I would mostly expect them to sign a running back in free agency and then to also draft a running back. But it's a question I think that you have to consider before you lay out the mock draft. The other two positions that I think are worth mentioning and just keeping in mind for all of us, really, are cornerback and safety. I mean, you guys know Stephon Gilmore, Byron Murphy Jr., Shaq Griffin. They're all set to become free agents. So obviously, while the team has high hopes for Mekhi Blackman still, and while they believe in the development of Dwight McGlothern, I mean, there's no question there is a hole at cornerback no matter how you shake it, how you slice it. That's just the reality. So do they spend that cornerback in free agency? Or if they don't, then that becomes a further priority in the draft. And then there's safety. Cam Bynum, I've said on the podcast, like I think the door remains open for him to return. I know he loves Minnesota, but it's going to be about finding the correct number, just as it was prior to the season with him. And so and then Harrison Smith, does he want to keep playing? Does he choose to retire? I think I would lean more towards the former at this point, but let's say you lose both those two guys, then it becomes a question, what do you do via free agency? Do you sign a Javon Holland, a Trayvon Moehrig from the Raiders, a Justin Reed from the Chiefs? I mean, there are a lot of question marks that could surface within the secondary, depending on certain aspects that happen or don't. Like if the Vikings in free agency sign DJ Reed for cornerback, then it probably becomes less of a priority in the draft. But that's how, like, this mock draft exercise this early, it's an interesting data point that I will be looking forward to calling back on. But until you see the process of how things go in free agency, it's very hard to be pinpoint in terms of what positions make the most sense at each round. So with that, I mean, the summary of that intro is like how free agency shakes out, and the process over these next few weeks will dictate the hierarchy of positional targets, of value, and all that stuff. And so how I lay out the 6 picks that I made will be in accordance, to one of those paths that I think are realistic that the Vikings could take. So we're going to get right into it. Right now, as it stands, the Vikings have 3 picks officially. So the first is a first round pick, number 24. Then they have 2 fifths. One of the fifths was it's part of the fifth for this year. The other one was via the trade with the Cleveland Browns for Zadarius Smith. Now, you guys might be asking, Alec, what about the 3rd round comp pick? Yes, that is projected. They're projected to have the 3rd round comp pick. So in total, they'd have a first, a third, and 2 fifths. Now, you guys also might be asking, what the heck happened to these other picks? Well, they traded the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th for Dallas Turner. And then the 6th and the 7th were involved in the Browns, the Zadarius Smith trade with the Browns. So essentially they turned the 6th and the 7th to what is a high 5th. So, I mean, you could litigate whether you'd rather have a 6th or a 7th or a high 5th. I think I'd rather have the high 5th. But the reality is they're lacking in picks. So what I did for this mock draft was I made a mock trade, moving down about 5 or 6 spots, kind of like the Bucks did with the Jags in 2022 in the late round, in the late first round, to create another 4th, and another 6th. So the way I did this mock draft was I was picking in the 1st round, the 3rd round comp pick, the 4th round via trade, the 5th round, the 5th round, and the 6th round via trade. That's how I did it, and that's how I was thinking about it. Now, the frame with which I made these picks, as I talked about with that first section, was not how it probably will go in terms of the Vikings spend their free agent money on interior offensive linemen. Because if they do that, then picking an interior defender at the top of this draft, to me, is makes sense. And that's probably the most optimal route. But in the vein of this Vikings team paying a Milton Williams or Osa from the Cowboys as a defensive tackle at a cost that makes sense, they would probably also sign a starting guard, but then you'd probably be in the market to draft one. And so the way I thought about my picks as well, it was assuming that a running back is signed, but they'd probably still draft a running back, assuming that a starting cornerback was signed, whether it's a Byron Murphy or someone else, but they still probably need to draft a cornerback. So the way I looked at it was like you needed interior offensive lineman, you needed running back, potentially another defensive tackle, and the depth at cornerback, potentially a wide receiver. So that's kind of how I looked at it. The first pick that I made in the 1st round is a guy, Tyler Booker from Alabama. Tyler Booker from Alabama is an interior offensive lineman, one of the best and maybe the best interior offensive lineman in this draft. He is massive, 6'5", 325 pounds. He's really good in pass protection. He's physical. Nick Saban recruited him from IMG Academy, where he actually played a season with J.J. McCarthy, so there is familiarity there. And then he was really known around Alabama. You talk to anyone down there, you read a lot of the scouting reports on him. He was known as a leader internally, a voice for Kalen DeBoer, their new head coach, kind of in the vein of a Will Anderson, who has helped transform that Houston Texans defense. And so the way I thought about it is, like, let's just say, for example, they sign a Milton Williams at the interior defensive tackle spot, and he plays alongside a Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel. I mean, the front starts to and maybe even, the front could be pretty interesting. So you have that. Then you probably sign interior offensive lineman, whether it's a Will Fries or whether it's a, in this session, Patrick McCarry, a Tevin Jenkins, probably, I don't know about him, but the other two make sense. And so then you'd still have a hole at one of the other guard spots, and you fill it with a guy on a rookie contract who steps in, who's going to be willing to put in the amount of work. I mean, that's often how I think about these draft picks. And I've talked about this on the podcast, but there is such uncertainty in making these selections. And so when you are doing it, I mean, to me, so often it's about betting on people. Now, how can you really project how a guy from outside your building is going to fit your building? It's very difficult. But Tyler Booker, to me, made sense in that mold. Now, one of the questions with him would be, does he get too late in the first round? I think the only way he does is if teams just play the positional value game and they don't want to draft an interior offensive lineman. But that's probably hard to see. There are going to be a lot of teams in the market to upgrade their fronts this offseason. So that was my first pick. Now, you come back in the third round, the player I chose was a guy, Josh Farmer from Florida State. He's big, like 6'3", 318, around there, 310, but he can move, and I've said this on the podcast before and I've written it, but Brian Flores, when he talks about these interior defensive linemen, and this Vikings staff that has learned what Brian Flores likes talks about these interior defensive linemen, what they often talk about is finding big guys who move like little guys. They want twitch. They want the potential to rush the passer. I mean, the two guys that were interior defenders that Brian Flores and the Dolphins drafted when he was the head coach there were Christian Wilkins and I believe Raekwon, what's his last? Raekwon Davis. I'm going to look this up real quick. He played at Alabama. And so, Raekwon Davis. So Raekwon Davis, both those guys were massive, but they were also movers. And so those were players that they took. Now, they also really liked Byron Murphy II last year out of Texas, who's a very Milton Williams type body type. And so the interesting thing for me going through these interior defensive linemen that could be available at the top of the draft, whether it's a Derek Harmon, a Walter Nolan, a Darius Alexander from Toledo, a TJ Sanders from South Carolina. There are a lot of a Kenneth Grant from Michigan. There are a lot of options, but for me, I mean, like Walter Nolan, this guy from Ole Miss, is extremely violent, very quick hands. When he's playing, he can really go. And if that guy's there at number 24 and the Vikings are picking, I mean, unless they've spent big on interior defensive line, like I'm projecting in this mock draft, that guy's probably going to be very hard to pass up. Now, again, this evaluation is not just what you see on tape. It's not just size. It's all of the other stuff, the personality, the willingness to work, all that factors into this. But this Josh Farmer, defensive tackle from Florida State, he's liked by a lot of people. I believe Daniel Jeremiah of NFL Network had him in his top 50. He played really well at the Senior Bowl, so I picked him in the third round. So you start the draft in my mock with an interior offensive lineman and an interior defensive lineman. And I wrote this in The Athletic, but it's like, I'm not just picking girth just for fun. I mean, this is a team that needs it and needs it in years to come. I mean, even if they sign a Milton Williams or an Osa from the Cowboys, a defensive tackle in free agency, there is a chance that Harrison Phillips, who was extended prior to this past season, you look at his contract. I mean, you could offload it next year. Now that's looking way far ahead. We'll see how he performed. Like there's a lot of data that has to go in to that becoming the thing. But I think adding depth in these spots to potentially replace current players is just smart and a good way to think about it. In the fourth round, I mean, this is where I think the people that I heard from about my mock draft were maybe the two aspects that it felt like people were most critical about were A, going the route taking an interior offensive lineman in the draft, but then B, this pick I made in the fourth round. And that's Trevor Etienne, the running back from Georgia. I mean, this guy, he's played 10 games every year in college. He's still young. You watch him on tape, and I have. He's quick. He's got vision. He can catch out of the backfield. He played in the SEC. He's in a family that knows what it's like to play at the NFL level. And so, I mean, he's a guy. Now, some of the criticism that I heard from people is like, in the fourth round over other guys. I mean, look, this running back draft in this class, as Rick Spielman said last week, he said this is about as loaded as he has ever evaluated running back class. And you could name, I mean, I could name 15 guys off the top of my head. Travion Henderson of Ohio State, Quinshawn Junkins of Ohio State. I mean, Jordan James from Oregon, Omarion Hampton from UNC, Caleb Johnson from Iowa, Ashton Jeanty, Boise State. I mean, literally, Damian Martinez from Miami, DJ Giddens from Kansas State. I mean, the list goes on, and RJ Harvey from UCF. It is a relentless class of interesting running backs. And so I get if certain people from the outside, you guys listening to this, have different flavors. But I spoke to an AFC evaluator who said to me, he had Etienne fourth behind Ashton Jeanty, Caleb Johnson, Omarion Hampton. So, and like I said, watching it on tape, I was very interested, and I know the level at which he's playing at Georgia, and I just like those guys who have done it in these big conferences, not just the conference, but in big conferences where he's running against very talented interior defensive linemen. So that was my fourth round pick. Again, I think Cam Skattebo, I didn't even mention, from Arizona State. I did want to mention this. One of the stats that I've been kind of curious about, and we have this thing called True Media that has a ton of advanced metrics, but kind of an interesting one for me. The running backs with the most carries of 4+ yards after contact. So really, like, how many times, you see the stat a lot, yards after contact, and that's an average. So let's say on one run, you got hit at the backfield and then you ran a 70-yarder. Well, that inflates your yards after contact number. This is more like, how many times do you get 4+ yards after contact? And first, by a large margin, is Ashton Jeanty. Second is Omarion Hampton. Third, Cam Skattebo. And then, I mean, you got to go down. 8th, Dylan Sampson. 9th, another running back in this class that's interesting, Kyle Monangai from Rutgers. 11th, Jordan James. 12th, Devin Neal from Kansas. Caleb Johnson is 12th. RJ Harvey from UCF, 17th. I mean, I will say, Trevor Etienne is down the list here. In this metric, he is 116th. So about half the runs of 4+ yards after contact than a Caleb Johnson, for example, from Iowa. So, I mean, that could be used against the selection. But for me, just watching on tape, I was very interested. And I thought, like, you pair him with an Aaron Jones for one more season, have him learn behind that type of talent, and it would be very interesting. My first 5th-round pick that I made was a cornerback who led the FBS in interceptions, guy Noel Williams from Cal. Believe he was at the East-West Shrine game, played pretty well, has good size. He's like 6 foot 200, I believe. But an interesting player and a cornerback with ball skills. He might not test incredibly well at the combine, but I'm less concerned about those metrics, the 40-yard dash. For me, it's like, what's your play speed? What's your mental processing ability on the field? Do you have ball skills that can make up for some of the speed? Because sometimes for me, I think some of that mental processing overcomes and it matters as much, if not more at times, than the explosiveness. The other 5th-round pick is an interesting one for me. His name's Clay Webb. He was a 5-star coming out of high school, went to Georgia. interior offensive lineman, by the way. And he went to Georgia. He played a couple seasons there. Then he transferred to Jacksonville State, but has had 2 great years these past 2 years. He was really good at the Senior Bowl. Again, a guy that I'm not sure is going to blow things out of the water at the combine, but he's a productive player. He's played a lot of snaps, and I know. I mean, Quesido Fomensa and the Vikings, they value young players who can potentially develop. But for me, especially in some of these later rounds, if you can take guys who have experience, they're battle tested, they've been around the block. I mean, to me, that's probably how I'd go about it. So he was my 5th round pick. And then the 6th round, I chose a guy that's more near and dear to my heart. He played receiver at Missouri. His name's Theo Weiss Jr. You guys might be asking, why receiver? Well, I would say that Jalen Naylor is entering the final season of his rookie deal. The Vikings don't have a ton of depth behind that. Theo Weiss is upwards of 200 pounds, so thicker, probably more of a blocker type, more in the body type of like a Trent Sherfield. He's got good hands. He can separate. He produced at the college level, and he played with a star in Luther Burden and kind of knows how to be kind of, just an ancillary piece. He did that in college. He's experienced. He's older. So again, that's the way that my mind kind of works for those later rounds. But those were the 6 picks. I'll go back and run through them once again. In the 1st round, Tyler Booker from Alabama, interior offensive lineman. In the 3rd round, Josh Farmer, defensive tackle from Florida State. In the 4th round, Trevor Etienne, running back from Georgia. 5th round, Noel Williams, cornerback from Cal. 5th round, Clay Webb, offensive guard from Jacksonville State, transferred from Georgia. And then 6th round, Theo Weiss Jr., receiver from Missouri. So that's the 6th round mock. I mean, it's for me, I'll be curious in the comment section, whether you're listening on YouTube or Spotify or Apple or reply on Twitter. I'll be very curious just to hear what you guys think of those selections. I mean, everyone has different perspective on the types of players they like. I'd say, I've watched probably 35 to 40 players on tape. I've also watched some of the free agents on tape. Now, is my view of the tape the gospel? Absolutely not. But I think it's important that I do the work in that regard and don't just look at all the advanced metrics. And even when I hear certain stuff from people internally, I want to fact check it with my own eyes, my own feel. And there are just some guys, like I mentioned Walter Nolan from Ole Miss earlier, where you're just watching them on tape and it's fun to watch them. And you feel like, man, that guy is like a game wrecker. And that's like, for me, having watched this Vikings team for 3 years, especially on the interior defensive line, it's like that is necessary. So I enjoy this process every year. I like studying these guys because it gives me a perspective even years to come. If they're free agents to be, I can recall some of the work that I did at this time. So, you see random stuff. It's like, I'm watching Ohio State, Penn State, and I see Travion Henderson just blow up a Penn State defender as a run blocker. I mean, that stuff is just incredibly impressive and stands out. So that's a 6th round mock. It was done, again, with the idea that free agency, they spent big on an interior defender. Be curious your thoughts on that. And then we're just going to hear more over this span of time. And definitely at the Combine in Indianapolis, there will be a lot of conversations had that I think will clue me and then you guys directly into what this team is thinking, what's possible, the potential free agent interest, and how that flows to the draft. So it's going to be fun to follow it over time. We'll do a few of these, probably a couple more at bare minimum, because I enjoy doing them and talking through it provides a really good perspective. But that'll do it for the mock draft episode 1.0. Appreciate you guys being here. That is episode 58 of the Alec Lewis Show. If you are not and you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like button down there, that little thumbs up, the subscribe button as well. That really helps us out. If you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or iHeart, or wherever you get your podcast, please follow us over there and rate. That helps us out. And we've enjoyed really over time growing this channel. So thank you guys for being here. We will be back next week with a couple episodes as well. Can't wait to do it. We'll have a guest next week talking draft. So stay locked in to the Alec Lewis Show and keep reading over at The Athletic. That was episode 58. We will talk to you guys very soon.